It is now time we move to our keynote lecture delivered by Professor Morgan. But before we do this, we will listen to a short introduction delivered by Professor Johannes Paulman. Please.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Morgan. My name is Johannes Paulman. I'm the director of the Leibniz Institute of European History at Mainz in Germany, and one of the co-organizers of the conference. No speech, just a warm welcome from the Institute, on behalf of the Institute. But now to Michael, our first keynote speaker, who will also join the following panel after his keynote. Michael is Professor of International History at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He specializes in modern, international, and global history. Michael is the author of a pertinent scholarly work to our conference. The title is The Final Act, the Helsinki Accords, and the Transformation of the Cold War. It was published by Princeton University. His book received the 2018 Edgar S. Furness Award for the best first book in international security. Michael was educated at the University of Toronto, Cambridge University, and Yale. Before joining the faculty at the University of North Carolina, he taught at the United States Naval War College and the University of Toronto, and was also a visiting fellow at the Sciences Po in Paris. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that warm introduction. Let me start by saying what an honor it is to be here with you to commemorate the signing of the Final Act and to do so in the building where it happened 50 years ago. It's also a pleasure to see so many colleagues and old friends in the audience. As many of you know, 50 years ago this summer, Helsinki was arguably, at least for a few days, the capital of the world. Journalists who observed the dozens of international leaders who were convening here in Finlandia Hall said that nothing like it had been seen since the Congress of Vienna in 1815, or perhaps the funeral of the British King, Edward VII, in 1911. It was a historic event by just about any measure. I'd like to say a few words this morning about why the Final Act mattered so much, where it came from, how it came about, how it shaped the post-Cold War world, and what its legacy might be today. So a little bit about the past, a little bit about the present, and a few words about the future. So to start with, why did the Final Act matter so much? This was a long, and if you've tried reading it, frankly dry diplomatic text. And there were many people in the 1970s who doubted that it deserved anyone's attention. Skeptics today might ask, why does it deserve our attention today? The simplest answer, I would suggest, is that buried beneath the thousands of words of diplomatic jargon, there lay a transformative vision of international order. Anyone who read the text closely could see, as the diplomats who negotiated it saw, that the agreement promised to change Europe in a number of profound ways. Let me give you just a few of the highlights. First of all, the Final Act said that Europe's borders, which seemed to be frozen by the nuclear standoff of the Cold War, could in fact be changed. They could be redrawn peacefully and through negotiation. This, of course, held out the possibility of reunifying Germany. The Final Act repudiated the Brezhnev Doctrine, and it affirmed that states could choose their own alliances. The Final Act stipulated that respect for human rights was not simply a desirable thing, as the UN Charter said. It went further than the UN Charter and said that respect for human rights was a fundamental principle of international security equal to state sovereignty and equal to the principle of non-intervention in domestic affairs. And the Final Act also lowered barriers of all kinds between East and West. It promoted closer contacts between people, between societies. It promoted the reunification of families. It promoted the free movement of books and magazines and movies and newspapers. It promoted greater transparency, greater openness, greater trust between militaries. If you put all of these ideas together, what they add up to was a sweeping program for redrawing the map of Europe. And not only that, but for undermining the principles on which the power of the Soviet world rested. The Final Act promised not to make the Cold War tolerable, but to make it obsolete. That was the goal of the Final Act. This, at least, was what the Western participants in the negotiations had in mind. Now, those Western negotiators did not expect that change would come about suddenly. Maybe it wouldn't even come about within their lifetimes. But they did hope that the text they negotiated would serve as a yardstick, a way of measuring states' behavior. It would serve as a compass, an instrument for pointing in the right direction. Hopefully, this would chart a course out of the Cold War. But of course, no matter how bold the vision in the Final Act, it was, as some critics said, just a piece of paper. It was not even binding under international law. So why was there any reason to think that it would be implemented? Why would anyone think that it would have power? Well, I'd suggest that the answer to this question, how could it be binding? How could it have power? The answer to that question also helps us to explain where the agreement came from in the first place. So I'd like to say a few words about the longer-term origins of this agreement. If there's one word that captures the origins of the Final Act, and we heard this yesterday evening, if there's one word that captures the origins, it's this: legitimacy. More specifically, the Eastern and Western orders, the international systems that had defined the Cold War in Europe for decades by the time that the negotiations began, both of these orders had tumbled into crises of legitimacy in the 1960s. These crises threatened governments' internal stability and their international partnerships, their alliances, their international systems. In the West, politicians, officials, journalists in the 1960s worried that NATO was headed for a crack-up. Nuclear equilibrium in the Cold War had the paradoxical result of reducing fears of conflict, fears of war, to the point that many civilians started to think that NATO itself had become obsolete. In addition to this, the Vietnam War, the American war in Vietnam, raised questions about the wisdom, the morality of American leadership. One of the United States' leading European allies, Charles de Gaulle's France, went so far as to withdraw from NATO's military institutions in a bid for greater autonomy and greater influence. On top of these international problems in the West, the Allies faced a rising tide of domestic discontent and economic dislocation. There were, of course, the wide-scale protest movements against the Vietnam War. But on top of that, citizens increasingly demanded that military spending be redirected into social programs. Students, intellectuals, citizens denounced the political and intellectual and social status quo that had defined the post-war period. Some of them questioned the underpinnings of liberal democracy itself. The tide of economic growth that had defined the post-war years began to ebb in the late 1960s. Unemployment rates rose. The Bretton Woods system began to fracture. So it seemed like all at the same time, the Western order, the American-led order, was facing domestic and diplomatic and social and intellectual crises of legitimacy, people questioning the underlying assumptions and institutions on which the Western order was based. And at the same time, of course, similar processes were at work in the Eastern world, in the Soviet-led order. Despite the rhetoric of socialist unity, some of Moscow's allies, like the Romanians, like the Poles, like the East Germans, in different ways and much more subtly than in the West, but they questioned Soviet leadership. They challenged Soviet leadership. The invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 demonstrated to Soviet leaders and to many others that the Soviet order could no longer rely on the threat or the use of military force to hold the communist bloc together. Alternatives to force needed to be found. In 1969, the Soviet Union and China stepped to the brink of war, shredding what little remained of their once formidable partnership. So these were the international crises of the Soviet world. Domestically, citizens were losing faith in the promises of communism, in the economic promises that communism would produce higher living standards than capitalism. Growth rates in the command economies were slipping by the late 1960s and showed little sign, there was little hope of them ever turning around. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev recognized that the ideas of Marxism, Leninism were losing their popular appeal among students, among small groups of intellectuals who, again, in small numbers, but increasingly began to speak out openly, to criticize Marxist-Leninist ideology and Soviet government policies. The suppression of the Prague Spring snuffed out the last flickerings of communist idealism, those flickerings of idealism that remained by the late 1960s among intellectuals in the Soviet bloc. So for all of these reasons, in the East, Soviet leaders too recognized that they were facing a gathering crisis of legitimacy that affected both their domestic institutions, their domestic principles, and their international partnerships. The Final Act, then, the CSCE, had its origins in Moscow's attempt to tackle these crises of legitimacy, to find new principles, to shore up the foundations of the Soviet system, to shore up the Soviet domestic order and the international order. Brezhnev hoped that the Soviet Union would become the world champion of peace, and that would become the USSR's main claim to international legitimacy and international leadership. He also hoped that détente in general and the CSCE in particular would revive the fortunes of the communist economy by encouraging greater trade, Western investment, access to technology, and so on. The Western reaction to this Soviet initiative was mixed. In Washington, of course, the Nixon administration in the late 1960s was open to these Soviet proposals. They welcomed the idea of détente in the hope of creating some geopolitical breathing room for the United States in the wake of Vietnam, in the hope of reclaiming some American freedom of action. And no one in the Nixon administration felt particularly strongly about Brezhnev's idea for a security conference in Europe. They thought, at best, this will be an anodyne diplomatic agreement. It's not going to change very much, and it's not going to do very much damage. So they were willing to offer this to the Soviets, perhaps in exchange for other things that they regarded as more important. But the Western European powers, America's NATO allies, saw things differently. Leaders like Georges Pompidou in Paris and Willy Brandt in Bonn, and I should say Urho Kekkonen here in Helsinki, aspired not necessarily to stabilize the Cold War, but certainly in the case of the NATO allies, they aspired to transcend it, to transcend the Cold War. They wanted to build bridges between East and West, to open new markets for Western firms, to bring Western ideas and Western culture and Western books and newspapers to Soviet and Eastern European citizens. And they hoped that this process of what Pompidou called interpenetration would improve the daily lives of citizens in Eastern Europe and the USSR, and over time would not just establish peace, but would erode the foundations of communist order, so as to produce not just stability, but a deeper peace than could ever have been possible in a divided Europe. And so what we had at the CSCE, in the negotiations here in Helsinki and in Geneva, was a collision, a conflict between rival visions of international order, rival definitions of peace, and rival concepts of legitimacy. Over the course of those negotiations, thousands of hours, hundreds of meetings, involving countless diplomats, gradually, the Western vision gained the upper hand. The Western representatives at the negotiations, with help from the neutrals like Finland and Austria and Sweden, maintained a united front, refused to compromise on their core demands, and effectively outlasted their Soviet and Eastern European interlocutors. But of course, the CSCE operated by consensus. No deal would have been possible unless the Soviets had been willing to make a deal. So why were they willing to agree to these Western demands? I think the short answer is that by 1975, Leonid Brezhnev had invested so much in producing an agreement. He had tied his name so clearly, so closely to the CSCE and to the idea, this project of European peace, that he could not bear to see it fail. And he insisted, he ordered that Soviet diplomats on the scene start to make concessions. And he calculated that those concessions would be livable, would be tolerable, would be manageable. But what makes this story even more complicated and in many ways more interesting is that some Soviet officials, including the head of the Soviet negotiating team, themselves wanted to see reform and themselves were open to some of those Western demands. They believed that the CSCE could be a spur to revive and reform and open up the Soviet system, to save it from itself, in a sense. Not to destroy communism, but perhaps to make it successful, finally. The Warsaw Pact's leaders in the summer of 1975 did not have any illusions about the text of the Final Act. They understood what Western governments were trying to do. They understood this transformative vision. They understood the Western hope of eroding the foundations of communism. But they signed the agreement nonetheless, either because they calculated, they gambled, that state sovereignty would protect them and save them from having to fulfill any of their promises, or, in the case, for example, of the East Germans, They reasoned that the Soviets were so determined to get a deal that they had no choice but to sign. They had to defer to Soviet leadership. That's how the Final Act, in my view, came about. So now, what were the consequences of the Final Act? How did it influence what remained of the Cold War? And what came afterwards? We can't say, I would argue, that the Final Act itself caused communism to collapse. It's too simple. But we can argue, I would argue, that the Final Act did hasten that process. It accelerated it in crucial ways. Not least because governments across the Soviet bloc trumpeted the text of the Final Act. They published it widely. They broadcast it to their citizens. They hoped that this agreement, despite its flaws, in their view, would bolster the legitimacy of their regimes. The Soviet government went so far as to incorporate the 10 crucial principles of the Final Act into the 1977 Soviet Constitution, word for word, as the foundations of Soviet foreign policy. But contrary to the expectations of communist leaders, they proved unable to contain, to restrain the effects of the Final Act. Small but influential groups of intellectuals and activists demanded that their governments live up to the promises that they had made through declarations like Charter 77, as some people in this room knew firsthand, participated in making that possible. During the CSCE's follow-up conferences in the 1970s and 1980s, liberal democratic governments collaborated with some of those dissidents to press the Soviets and their allies to live up to their promises too, building cross-border networks to promote reform, to promote greater openness. The Soviets were outraged by these efforts, but they nonetheless stuck to the CSCE. They refused to abandon it. Why not? Simply put, by this point, they had tied themselves so closely to this process, so closely to this document, that they couldn't repudiate it at almost any price for fear of undermining their own legitimacy. After taking office in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev magnified these effects in ways that no one could have predicted. His program of domestic and international reform echoed the fundamental principles of the Final Act, and some of those reforms enacted explicitly some of the Helsinki principles, releasing dissidents from prison, allowing greater freedom of speech, ending the jamming of Western radio broadcasts, striving to build East-West trust on military matters. And in his internal struggles within the Soviet system against hardliners, opponents of reform, Gorbachev invoked the Final Act to say, look, we made these promises, we need to reform domestically to live up to our promises. In keeping with the principles of the Final Act, he also heeded the idea of peaceful change of frontiers in the negotiations to reunify Germany in 1990. After the Berlin Wall fell, after Germany reunified, the Final Act provided, I would argue, a blueprint for post-Cold War Europe. Someone yesterday mentioned the Paris Charter, and I think that document summarizes better than any other the way in which the Final Act shaped post-Cold War Europe. The Cold War did not end with a grand peace conference or a grand peace treaty, but it did have the Paris Charter, which served as the next best thing to a peace treaty for post-war Europe. And the Paris Charter, signed at the CSCE's first summit meeting since the 1975 one in Helsinki, recapitulated the Final Act's principles and respect for human rights and democracy. Now, these developments didn't clarify, the Paris Charter did not clarify some of the inherent tensions and ambiguities in the Final Act, like the tension between respect for sovereignty and respect for human rights. And in many ways, the story of international politics in the 1990s and after is the story of the struggle over this tension the tension between sovereignty and human rights. Now, over the last decade, as we've heard already, some of these core principles have come under attack. The core principles of the CSCE have come under attack, not just from Russia with its war of aggression against Ukraine, but by other countries too, including, I have to say, the United States. The current administration's threat to seize territory from other countries by force is a fundamental violation of the text of the Final Act and, of course, of the UN Charter. So what remains of the Final Act today? What inspiration can we draw from it if, in many ways, it has been kicked to the curb of international politics? Well, one impulse, I think, would be to defend those principles, to try to hold countries to the text of the CSCE. I think that's a justifiable and important impulse. But I want to suggest a different possibility, one that may be more in keeping with the spirit of Helsinki. This possibility is the possibility of transformation. After all, the diplomats in the early 1970s were not simply looking to defend the status quo. They were looking to transcend the status quo. The process of negotiating the Final Act was, for the Western participants, an exercise in creativity, not in conservatism. And so in thinking about the future of European and transatlantic security, I would suggest that we can draw inspiration not simply from the model of what happened 50 years ago, not just the text of the Final Act, but the true spirit of Helsinki is the spirit of creativity, of innovation, of laying down new principles, of building new institutions that respond to the crises of the moment, rather than simply trying to uphold the principles that were relevant 50 years ago. So perhaps the best way to honor Helsinki, to honor the work done here in Finlandia Hall, is not simply, or not only, to defend the past, but to look for new ways to create the future. Thank you very much.